Sorry about that. All right. So, hello. Another day in paradise, huh? I do notice that people are starting to put off logging in. So, I'll keep my joke going because I'm guessing traffic must be real bad this morning. Don't worry, they'll come rolling in. Funniest thing about online, right? We always online teaching. I do it too. Kind of just wait until the last second. Morning time management just isn't quite as good. Maybe, more family that you're having to deal with, kids and stuff. Oh man, that exam was an easy one. Don't you love it when professors say that? Here's the deal. The exams will get harder, but you will have gone through more material as we go through these next exams. And we're reusing. That's what I love about physiology is you're always reusing old knowledge. Are you perfect at learning everything the first time? Of course not. No, nobody really is. But the more we use it, the more we understand its use, which is a pretty powerful thing. Like everything in life, the first time you learn something about whatever, typically we don't have an understanding of why it's important and how we're going to be utilizing it in our future lives. But the more that we see something, the more it'll make sense. For instance, today we're going to be talking more about what happens in the contractile cardiomyocytes. Well, guess what? A lot of the information that I've been reviewing will come back into play today. So you're going to get to see it again. And then soon, some of this stuff that just seemed like it was impossible to learn the first time, it just becomes part of your reflex. It just makes sense. And that's what we're after, right? I think that's what we're all after. True story? You all there? So that's the approach I try to take as a professor. It's teaching a really hard subject. This is hard material, but doing it in a way that relates more to real life sometimes, and therefore easier to retain and redundancy. Faux show. So, speaking of redundancy, why is this all cockeyed? Who did that? All right, give me a second here. I'm guessing my. All right, cool. So we got our clean slate here. And let's just remind ourselves of a couple of things. Beginning of a lot of my classes will be a review material. So, first part of the review material goes as follows. This is something every time you go to sit down and study cardiophysiology, I recommend that you do. Function of the heart is what? What is the function of the heart, physiologically speaking? Now you guys are a little wiser. Love it. So we write cardiac output down. We're talking about the heart right now. And the second you start talking about the heart, you should be talking about cardiac output. And what does cardiac output equal? Remember, this is one you must know, you must know, you must know. So push yourself, especially here at the beginning. Heart rate times stroke volume. So we're going to write this formula down because if we're talking about the heart, we will be talking about heart rate times stroke volume to some degree or the other. Whether it's heart rate, which is created by which of the two cell types found in the heart, which of the two cardiomyocytes determines heart rate. Exactly. So when we're dealing with these things, heart rate is going to be in beats per minute, and it's going to be created by autorhythmic cells. And how do autorhythmic cells do what they do? What exactly does an autorhythmic cell do? What makes it autorhythmic? I know it's a weird question, so I might get a few different answers. Oh, great. No, perfect. You guys got it, right? It creates its own action potential. That's what makes it self. It's able to create its own action potential because why? What's the whole magical word that's a little bit easier to learn? Because it's leaky. Yeah, because it's leaky. Because it's leaky to ions. True story? Autorhythmic cells are leaky to ions. And so if we go to think about these autorhythmic cells and how they are leaky to ions, we can relatively quickly draw a smaller action potential graph. We still want to label it because we want good habits. Membrane potential, but I'm going to abbreviate that now. It's always in millivolts, again, because we want good habits. What was the resting membrane potential? Good. -60. Not -70 this time. It's -60. And we walked through the reasons why it's -60 and not -70. The reason why is because potassium leaks out. Potassium leaks out. But then, if only potassium leaked out, what would the membrane potential be, Ashley? If there was only potassium leaking out of a cell, if there was only potassium leak channels, what would that membrane potential be? That would be -90 millivolts. So you guys might not very many people answered that quickly. So if there's only potassium leak channels, it would be at -90 millivolts. What do you mean why? The reason why is because only potassium would be leaking out of cells. And as positive charges leave the inside of the cell becomes more negative. But like every single concentration gradient in the world, right? As high moves to low, the low starts to get higher. Does that make sense? As high is moving to low, the low is starting to get higher. So we're balancing this, right? As high moves to low, down here is getting material. So it starts to level off, and eventually it's going to reach a point where it can't become even any more negative at all. So -90 is the magic number if there's only potassium leak channels. Now, if we start throwing in sodium leak channels, we're jumping back up to -70, and when we start adding calcium leak channels, we get to -60. Okay, awesome. So this is our resting membrane potential. And then yesterday, we learned about specific channels that they don't leak all the time. They're open for short periods of time, then they close. They're called transient. Exactly. Now, the first transient leak channel that's open has a real knee slapper of a name. Exactly. So what we have here is we have a scenario where we have funny leak channels that are open. Then, yep, what ion do they allow through? That's a great question to answer, Tariq. So that's good. What ion is able to enter the cell now because the funny channels are open? Sodium. Good. Now, those funny channels will close, and what type of channel will open? T-type calcium channels. Transient calcium leak channels. Good. And they're going to keep leaking calcium in until threshold is reached. And what will always open at a threshold? This was a very vague question, so I need a vague answer. What will always open at a threshold? Voltage gated channels, wonderful. That is the vague answer I was looking for. Now in autorhythmic cells, what are those voltage gated channels? That's the next part of the question. Great job. I'm gonna grab my dog here because he is barking, and I need him in my office. Come on, buddy. All right. Sorry about that. Dog seeing Grandma and Grandpa are still in town. They're taking care of the grandkids, but my dog seems to think that he needs to protect them against maybe hummingbird farts. I'm not exactly sure what he's barking at, but he won't stop. So he's very protective. Yeah, very, very protective. Awesome. Okay, so at threshold, we have a voltage gated calcium channel that's going to open and it's going to go shooting up to about +5. Yeah, thanks for reminding me to write this in, Tariq. Great. Threshold for this is -40, approximately. Okay, this is again because that voltage gated calcium channel is open, calcium influx, it's flooding in, rapid pace, flooding in. All right, let's change up our colors. Now at peak, about +5 again, ish. +5, +10. What's going to end up happening is that voltage gated calcium channel has to close. That's that L-type calcium channel, and then it's going to come back down because we opened up a voltage gated potassium channel, driving a repolarization phase. Down here at the base, boom, we just go right back to funny. And then T-type. And then L-type, voltage gated, same thing. And then voltage gated potassium channel. So good news, this happens every single time your heart beats. Yeah, that's quite a life cycle of autorhythmicity. Was this review just a nice little review? Still fresh on your mind from yesterday's lecture? Now, we called this area under threshold a pacemaker potential, and we also went into this whole idea of it having a rate of depolarization. Because it's leaky, and those ions are just, kind of randomly leaking across the membrane through channels, if we change the leakiness of that membrane, we can change the speed at which ions enter that cell. Does that make sense? If we change the leakiness, if we change the opening of that door ever so slightly, we're going to change how ions enter this cell, and therefore we can change the rate of depolarization. Something I did not mention yesterday is a reminder that action potentials are all or none. They either happen or they don't. And all action potentials look identical. So the area above threshold will always look exactly the same. That's an important note. We can start to change the area above the curve if we have a pathophysiology, but not in normal physiology. Is that clear? So we're not going to deal with ever changing the action potential of this curve. If I ask you guys to draw these action potentials, they should always look as close to the same as you can make them, please. What part of this curve changes? depending on your heart rate. Only the pacemaker potential. Does that make sense? And if we hit threshold faster, what's going to happen to the heart rate? Increase, decrease, no change. And if we hit threshold slower, what's going to happen to that heart rate? Increase, decrease, no change. So as we increase the rate of depolarization and decrease the rate of depolarization, we change the heart rate. And that's going to be a function primarily in normal physiology of the sympathetic nervous system speeding up the heart, changing the permeability of the membrane to sodium and calcium, and the parasympathetic nervous system slowing down the heart, also changing the permeability of that membrane, just changing it in the opposite direction. Which one are you talking about? AP in my, oh yeah. We're getting there. They are very different. Yeah. Because these are contractile myocardial cells. Contractile myocardial cells are not auto, right? They cannot produce their own action potential. Now we're going to get there next. So let's get there, but we have to make sure that we review one more thing, because these action potentials are being created in the natural pacemaker. So what is the natural pacemaker? What is the other name for it? You keep wanting to call it SV, it's SA. So it's a sinoatrial node. Sinoatrial node, so SA. All right, cool. So we went and drew this out, basically. You know, you can draw a heart, and then I guess I'll draw a small heart right here. Impasta. I've had students tell me I suck at drawing hearts, and I have to agree. But basically, most of the current of your heart starts way up here in the upper right-hand corner. Remember, that's anatomical position, so that's the patient's right side of their heart. And that's the SA node. And then from the SA node, the SA node is leaky, and it creates an action potential. And this action potential, as it's created, goes shooting through the heart. But what part of the heart does it shoot through first? What regions of the heart am I going through right now with this figure 8? Exactly. So it's going to be going through the atria first before making it down to the AV node down below. So what are the name of the pathways between the SA node and the AV node? These are called the internodal pathways. Good. The internodal pathways. And that's finally going to reach that AV node. And the AV node is going to slow down the signal ever so slightly because of what type of tone? What's helping to slow down both the SA node and the AV node? I don't know why I wrote nodal. AV nodal is just AV node. Good. So this is called parasympathetic tone, and it creates an AV nodal delay, slowing that heart rate down to your resting heart rate of about 60 beats per minute. Now, all of this signal is going to pass down through a single tract of conducting gap junctions before entering the interventricular septum. What's the name of that tract? This bundle, right? This is the bundle of His. And then from here, it makes it into the interventricular septum, and it starts to branch all the way down to the apex. Those are called bundle branches. And finally, at the apex of the heart, it's going to have these beautiful, very unique fibers that spread out through the rest of the heart. What are those fibers called? I don't think I ever made you write that down yesterday in chat. Great job. Good interaction, y'all. Appreciate it, and you will appreciate it too, I think, in the long run. All right? Key to learning is redundancy, and part of redundancy is saying the word, thinking the word, writing the word. If you just do it one way, it doesn't stick in your brain. You have to do it multiple ways. And that's what creates multiple short-term memories, and then all those short-term memories compile into a long-term memory. So the more different ways we do our short-term memories, the easier it will be to recall it later. I hope that makes sense. It's a really important part of studying. Don't do it one way, no matter how comfortable you are with it. It'll make it harder to recall on an exam, I promise. Now, as this electrical signal, because remember, what we're talking about here with this conduction pathway, we're talking about conduction of this action potential. When the action potential is on, it's traveling through this pathway. When the action potential is off, there's nothing going through this pathway. Does that make sense? It's a light switch, on, off, on, off, on, off. This current spreads out through the heart and it hits contractile myocardial cells. And that's what we need to talk about now, are these contractile myocardial cells. Also just contractile myocardium. Ooh, I wrote off the top, sorry. Contractile myocardium. Now, we can draw out contractile myocardium. So if you'll recall yesterday, I said that, you know, these cardiomyocytes, they're not actually circular. They're rectangular. And if we were to draw it out, we would end up saying something along this lines, right? Where we had one contractile myocardial cell on this side, and then the end of this, you know, it's got this intercalated disc, so it's a little bit jagged and sticky. And it's going to stick to the next contractile myocardial cell. So we're going to draw it in next to it. And this next contractile cardiomyocyte, you know, we're not going to draw all the bifurcations and stuff on it. But we will end up kind of making sure to show that, you know, muscle cells, they have a specialized plasma membrane that can invaginate down into the cell itself. Down into, and as it does, this invagination is going to basically, you know, run along these gigantic, big-ass bags of calcium, right? And it's this invagination that's going to allow electrical signals to dive down throughout this cell. And exactly right. So what are these guys called over here? If I'm drawing this out, what would that be right there? Technically, there'd be one on the other side. Didn't draw that perfect, but you guys get the point. And I didn't even draw it over here. And it's all a matter of a representation of diagram that works. So what I'm trying to say here is in these conducting fibers, in between our cells, we have these gap junctions. And gap junctions are a pore. Okay, they're a pore that allows for whatever's happening in one cell to be transported from one cell to the next cell over. Something else I find that students need a reminder on, or maybe even a lesson on, period, but I don't have time for a full lesson here, is exactly what an action potential is. So what an action potential is it's conduction. It's traveling electricity. So what's going to end up happening is if we're just looking at one cell membrane and we create an action potential here, maybe here is that autorhythmic cell, for instance, and we create an action potential. This action potential needs to get from here down to here. And the way it does it is it's going to activate voltage-gated sodium channels. I know the action potential was created by voltage-gated calcium channels, but the conduction of electricity is because we have other voltage-gated channels. So if I have a voltage-gated sodium channel, and I have an action potential that's traveling this direction, when that action potential hits the voltage-gated sodium channel, what's it going to do to the voltage-gated sodium channel? Just a simple question. It's going to open it. And when it opens, what ion is going to be able to enter the membrane right here? Well, it's sodium. And therefore, what continues to happen to the inside of this cell? Well, it becomes more positive. So we're just going to draw in some positive charges here. So now, right next to this voltage-gated sodium channel, say for instance right here, I have another voltage-gated sodium channel. And so as sodium rushes in and sodium builds up on the inside of this cell membrane, we're building up positive charges. True story? Well, what's going to happen when these positive charges hit the neighboring voltage-gated sodium channel? What's going to happen to this voltage-gated sodium channel? It's going to open. And what's going to come rushing in at that point? More sodium. So now we start building up more positive charges. Well, guess what? There's another neighboring sodium voltage-gated sodium channel. So what's going to happen when those positive charges hit that one? Well, shit, it opens. And this is a continuation of positive charges opening up the neighboring voltage-gated channels. And that's what we draw. When we draw the lightning bolt, this is what we're trying to draw. It's positive charges that are accruing, opening the next voltage-gated channel, accruing, opening the next voltage-gated channel, so forth, so on. This is an action potential. Does that make sense to everybody that might have knew a little bit about this, but maybe it's helpful? And so that's what's happening throughout these contractile myocardial cells is we're going to start with some positive charges that are moving, right? These positive charges, it's great to start with a blank slate because then we draw these positive charges in. This is an action potential, and I'm drawing it as it moves. And as these positive charges build up right here, well, shit, they're going to go from high to low. They're going to move through the gap junction, and that's going to allow positive charges to start building up on this side. Does that make sense? And as it goes, it's opening up voltage-gated sodium channels, and we conduct electricity. This is current. This is the movement of ions. Make sense? Awesome. Awesome. This is a really important thing because once it makes it to these contractile myocardial cells, these contractile myocardial cells are going to do exactly what they're named for. They're going to contract. They're going to contract. How? I hope you guys are asking that question, or at least starting to ask that question, or maybe asking yourself how and then shaking your head and going, God, he's doing it to me. He's making me think how this is going to suck. I don't care. Whatever makes you guys think how, that's what I'm after. So how do these contractile myocardial cells contract? That's the rest of today's lecture. So first, the first thing we'll talk about is another action potential curve. Because here in a contractile myocardium, the action potential continues. It's going to actually go all the way down this myocardial cell, hit the next, hit the next, hit the next. But these contractile myocardial cells have specialized voltage-gated channels. that aren't found in the rest of the conduction pathway. And that's what allows these myocardial cells to contract. So let's draw some of these in. I'm not going to draw them in here yet. What I am going to do is I'm going to draw an action potential curve, and we're going to think about each one of these different receptors and transporters as we go. So similar to this one, but we're going to draw it a little bit bigger because it's the first time we're learning this curve. That is not a straight line. It looks straight to me, but that's because I'm sitting over at an angle. So there's going to be time, always in milliseconds. This is going to be membrane potential. Potential telling us voltage, always in millivolts. And this is for contractile myocardial tissue. Now, the first thing I'm going to tell you is that the membrane potential at rest for contractile myocardial cells is negative 90. Dun, dun, dun. If anybody's seen Crudes 2. Dun, dun, dun. So what does that tell us? If the resting membrane potential is negative 90. Am I there? Are you there? You guys drawing it in probably? And which leak channel, Andy? Only one leak channel, but which one is it? It's not hyperpolarized, Tariq. Stop saying that, my friend. This is normal. This is rest. Hyperpolarization means that it is below resting membrane potential. This is not below resting membrane potential. This is resting membrane potential. So this is ISO, man. This is whatever, normopolarized. This is happy because I'm happy. Every single cell membrane gets its own resting membrane potential. This one has no sodium leak channels. You got it. That's what makes this one special. It only has potassium leak channels. It does not have sodium leak channels. Nor does it have calcium leak channels. You're going to find that it has a whole bunch of other activated channels, but not all sorts of leak channels. Sorry, I had to get a nice big gulp of coffee. Okay, so the way this works is these contractile myocardial cells, man, they're chill. They're kind of honey badgers. Yes, old reference. They don't care. And they're just chilling here. And they're just going to live at resting membrane potential as long as they can. They're going to be down here at negative 90. So this is going to be phase 0 for this contractile myocardial cell. It's at resting membrane potential. But you can see it's a flat line here at first. Where does a contractile myocardial cell receive its electricity from? Oh, it's receiving it from, let's not go AV, let's be a little, let's go ahead and just say AR, the autorhythmic cell. And it's going to have to go through the AV node and the bundle of His and the bundle branches before it makes it out to the ventricles. But we got to remember that these contractile myocardial cells, man, they're here. They're right in the, the internodal pathways are feeding atrial myocardium. So, yeah, they're all over the dang place. So where do they get this from? They're going to get this from the autorhythmic cells. Now, what voltage is shooting down the cell membrane of these contractile myocardial cells? Well, shit, it's getting an action potential that started at +5. It started at +5, so we're already way up here. You see what I'm saying? So when that current hits this contractile myocardial cell, this is going to shoot like straight up because so much current is rushing down this cell membrane. And when it hits it, the current is already way the hell up here. Does that make sense? It doesn't mean there's not voltage-gated channels, because there are, because we have to continue this action potential just like we did here. Yes, exactly, because the charge is already basically at +5. Well, we're going to go even higher here in just a second. So these membranes still do have voltage-gated channels because they need to continue that action potential, so the next cell over can get the action potential too. So there is a threshold. Definitely a threshold still. The threshold is a bit lower than normal. Okay, it's not -40, it's not -55. The threshold is about -70 for these cells. But that's just a function of cell to cell. And that's because there is a slightly different isoform of the voltage-gated channel that's found here. But remember, threshold is the energy required to open a voltage-gated channel. That's how we've defined it quite a few times. We have plenty of energy that's traveling along the cell membrane as an action potential. We have plenty of energy to activate the next set of voltage-gated channels. Does that make sense? Plenty. More than enough. So actually, let's draw in a 1 here. So 0 is resting membrane potential. 1, this is depolarization caused by the autorhythmic action potential that has traveled through the conduction pathway before reaching the myocardium. So 1 is the autorhythmic action potential causing rapid depolarization. So I'm going to change to a more drastic color here, and we're going to try to make this pink. It'll work. All right, so at threshold, we're going to have some voltage-gated channels that open. I hope that makes sense. And this is going to go shooting up and up and up. So we know this voltage-gated channel that's going to open must allow positive ions to enter the cell. Here's the good news about the contractile myocardial cells is they're very similar to neurons and skeletal muscles. And do you guys remember what type of voltage-gated channel opened for neurons and skeletal muscles? What type of voltage-gated channels? Yeah, whether you remember it or not, seems like you guys were a little bit slow on answering this one. For neurons and skeletal muscles, at threshold, a voltage-gated sodium channel opens. It's only in the heart that we get those voltage-gated calcium channels that open that can create an action potential. Nowhere else in the body does calcium help drive action potentials. So here at 2, voltage-gated sodium channels are opening. I think I might actually have enough room to do this time. So at 0, we're at RMP. At 1, we're receiving an action potential from the autorhythmic cell. ARAP arrives at the myocardia. And then we get rapid depolarization. Here at 2, we said a voltage-gated sodium channel opens. So what does that tell us? about the ion that's rushing into the cell right here. What ion is going to be rushing into the cell, driving this depolarization step? Sodium. This is called sodium influx entering that cell. Is everybody with me so far? Because there's still more to learn. Always more to learn. More to review. Always more to review. Cool. So in A&P1, just depends on your professor, you may or may not have learned about the different aspects of voltage-gated sodium channels and voltage-gated potassium channels, but they are not the same channels. They have a different protein structure. A voltage-gated sodium channel has a couple of gates. They have activation gates and inactivation gates. Do you guys kind of remember that? Something you're supposed to get taught, but not every student does. So there's two gates on a voltage-gated sodium channel. One starts closed and the other one starts open. One starts closed and the other one starts open. So if I have sodium and I have a gate that's closed, can sodium get through this channel? No. So what's going to have to happen? Mechanical. No, I'm not, Heather. I don't understand your question, but that's okay. We'll get back to it. Let's get through this. As long as this gate is closed, I'm sure you know what you're talking about there, Heather, but I'm not understanding the context exactly. As long as this gate is closed, can sodium get through? Yes or no? Everybody? No. Perfect. Thank you, Heather. And what needs to happen to this gate for sodium to get through? Activate this gate or close this gate? Activate or inhibit? A or I? So does it stand to reason that this gate here is called an activation gate? In order to activate this channel and make it work, we need to open this channel or activate it. Does that make sense? So this is an activation gate, and it's the activation gate that has a threshold of approximately -60, -70. It just depends on what tissue we're talking about. But in myocardial cells, the threshold's at -70 millivolts. So that's the one that opens when threshold is reached. Yes, no, maybe so? Cool. This other one, what's going to happen if it closes? Well, if this one closes, it will inactivate the gate. Does that make sense? If this one were to close, then it will inactivate the gate. So this is called an inactivation gate. And the inactivation gate, like all gates, is actually activated by threshold. It's activated by voltage, but it moves a little bit slower. So the inactivation gate doesn't close until we've reached peak voltage. So voltage gated sodium channel, well, the activation gate opens, and then at the very peak, the inactivation gate closes. Pretty bizarre, pretty awesome. Why is it like this? Why does the voltage gated sodium channel not just close? Because what was the requirement to open the activation gate? What's the requirement to open voltage gated sodium channels? Threshold. So as long as it's above threshold, this gate has to be open. It's its energy requirement. Does that make sense? So I can't close this gate if it's above threshold. It's just not possible. So I have to have a second gate to close, and that's what that inactivation gate is for. Otherwise, it would remain open and sodium would continue to rush into the cell, and that's not good. Not good at all. I hope that made sense to most everybody. If not everybody, I hope it made sense to everybody. Now, voltage-gated potassium channels are the old ball and chain. So voltage-gated potassium channels don't have these just, protein pores that can collapse and open, because that's technically what these gates are. Instead, voltage-gated potassium channels have this big, long, coiled protein chain, and at the end of that, they have a big ball. So this is called the ball and chain. And these guys are flexible, and energy requirements, voltage requirements, can change the position of the ball. So this ball actually starts in the pore. Okay, so if this ball right here were to move up into the pore, can anything get through? Yes or no? No, of course not. So what's going to happen is voltage is going to stimulate this ball to move. And how is the ball actually moving? It has to do with these protein coils over here. So as the protein coils kind of stiffen, then the protein ball is going to move away from the pore. Is everybody with me on that? When voltage comes into the system, this coil starts to stiffen, and this ball is going to slowly move away from that pore. It's slow. It's really slow process mobilizing a protein chain. I shouldn't say really slow. It's relatively slow. It's still pretty damn fast. But you can think of this like a door in a crowded room. Because if I have a bunch of kids that are trying to get out of this room and this door is opening slowly, are all these kids going to be able to rush out at the same time? No. The door opens a little bit, maybe a few kids can get out, and as that door gets bigger and bigger and bigger, more and more kids can rush out. True story? All right. Now, here's where things get real confusing. You're welcome. That was a sarcastic you're welcome, in case you didn't know. But the body is not simple. There are a lot of different variations of the same types of channels. So voltage-gated potassium channels, voltage-gated sodium channels, there's lots of different isoforms of these things, lots of different subtypes. In voltage-gated potassium channel in the heart, there are two major types that you guys need to know about. One opens a little bit faster, and we call this one a transient. Yes, it's a transient voltage-gated channel. So this is going to be a T-type voltage-gated potassium channel. And these ones open, EGADs, I spelled channels wrong. These guys open relatively fast. The ball and chain, the ball moves out faster than its normal isoform. So this is one type of voltage-gated potassium channel found in myocardial tissue, and the other type is just called normal, which is nice. So we're just going to call these normal voltage-gated potassium channels, but these ones are relatively slow relative to the fast. Does that make sense? The doors are just opening at different speeds. Just think of them as doors that open at different speeds. Everybody's been to that building that has like the disabled access doors, right? You push the button, and everybody's been to that building where the door opens stupidly slow, right? You know what I'm talking about? It's like can't get through that door until it's open. You guys know what I'm talking about. And then everybody's also been to those places where the door, or even like the motion sensing doors, they do this too. Like sometimes those stores, the motion sensing doors just like go, come on, what is this, 1960? All right, let's go. But that's the same thing going on here. So let's get back to our action potential, because these different types of voltage-gated sodium channels are important. What do we know activates voltage-gated potassium channels? An action potential. So this is confusing to students, but doesn't it stand to reason that they start to open right here? Because that's threshold. That's where the energy is building up. That's where voltage is building up. So what else starts to open here at 2? Not only do voltage-gated sodium channels open, but the voltage-gated potassium channels start to open. Does that make sense? Are they fully open? No, they're not fully open yet, but they're definitely moving. They're mobilizing. This might be something different than you learned in A&P 1. That's because I think it's a more difficult subject to teach, that there are different speeds to opening a voltage-gated potassium channel. So I think a lot of professors just get frustrated with it and they just let it be. But to me, this is really important, because what if we can manipulate the speed at which voltage-gated potassium channels open? Then we now start to manipulate the entire area above this curve, don't we? And this is a really important level of understanding for medicine, is that every single step that I'm putting in, every channel, every ion, every one of these can create a disease. What if we block the opening of voltage-gated sodium channels? What's going to happen to your action potential? Increase, decrease, no change. Oh, that sounds bad, Dr. H. Yeah, you better believe that's bad. And these are what some of those cardiotoxins that frogs can make. They're literally voltage-gated sodium channel blockers. That's what lidocaine is. That's how we can numb local anesthetic, right? It's not for the cardio by any means. Oh yeah, there's lots of poisonous dart frogs out there that create cardiotoxins. Lots of cool stuff out in the world, Heather. And this is how actually a lot of pharmacology, pharmacists and stuff are learning about these different drugs, as they're applying what they're finding in nature. Anyways, moral of the story is that each one of these different steps can be manipulated, and that's important to me, and it should be important to y'all. So these voltage-gated potassium channels start to open. Sweet. Now, way up here at the top, I had a color going. I then put the color away. I think it's this one. Way up here at the top, something really bizarre is going to happen. Because, first off, sodium stops rushing in. And the only way that can happen is if the voltage-gated sodium channels close. But this is the inactivation gate. True story? So if I say voltage-gated sodium channels close, what I'm actually talking about is the inactivation gate. You guys can write that in if it's something that you did not know before. At the peak, the voltage-gated sodium channels are going to close, but it's the inactivation gate that does that. So if we had a pharmaceutical drug that blocked the closing of the voltage-gated inactivation gates, well, then we can prolong the action potential. Now, the next thing I can talk, I swear. The next thing that's going to happen is that one of these voltage-gated potassium channels are going to be fully open. What two types of voltage-gated potassium channels did you learn about? One opens fast and one opens slow. Yes, no, maybe so? So here at the peak, we're going to have a voltage-gated potassium channel, but this is the fast one. This is that T-type one. It's going to open, but it's only going to be open for a very short period of time. It's transient. Does that make sense? Based on what we learned here with transient channels, they open, then they close. They open, then they close. And as long as a potassium channel is open, potassium rushes out of that cell, and the inside of the cell becomes more negative. So this one is going to open, but then it's going to close. So this is not going to repolarize all the way because it's just a real transient opening and closing. I'm out of room to write my notes. I was worried about that. Next. Sorry. Next. Right here at 4. I want to remind you guys that those other voltage-gated potassium channels, the slow, normal ones, they're still opening. They're not fully open, but they're still opening. So can some potassium leak out of the cell right now? Yes or no? Yeah, they're slowly opening, but they're still open. So there's potassium that's leaking out of this cell right now. But here's where I'll say stuff, well, even though I've said a few curse words already this go around, really hits the fan. And the fact of the matter is that these contractile myocardial cells have a very unique voltage-gated channel. This is where we're going to start to apply the L-type wording. Okay, so all along the cell membrane of a contractile myocardial cell and down into the T-tubules of the contractile myocardial cell, we have an L-type calcium channel. L-type calcium channel. And as current, because that's what we've been drawing in here so far, right? We've been drawing in current. We got all of these plus charges, plus charges, plus charges. As sodium is rushing into this cell, we're getting plus charges, plus charges. Does that make sense? No. In 2, both slow and normal are opening here in step 2. It's all voltage-gated potassium channels. All voltage-gated potassium channels start to open at threshold. One opens really fast and then closes, and the other one's going to be normal. We'll add that more to the story in just a minute. Good question. Did that make sense though, Tariq? Awesome. Did what I just say about charges make sense to everybody? Is we're having plus charges entering the cell, and that's the same thing as drawing it right here along this membrane of the diagram. As sodium rushes in, we're getting plus charges. Yes, no, maybe so? It's the exact same idea. One, we want to think about the action potential itself. And the other one, as these plus charges are building up on the inside of the cell, look what happens. They just hit an L-type calcium channel in my diagram. Yes? Which opens up that L-type calcium channel. It's a voltage-gated calcium channel. As current hits it, it's going to open. And I used the, I'm going to switch to this color blue because I did it up here. Not going to work very well, but what's going to happen is a voltage-gated calcium channel is going to open, and calcium can now start to rush into this cell. And what current is coming in with calcium? Plus charges, negative charges, positive charges. Positive charges are now rushing into this cell. But remember what I said about potassium. Those voltage-gated potassium channels are slowly open. They're not fully opened yet by any means, but I have potassium leaving the cell at the same time that calcium is entering the cell. Is everybody with me? Here at 4, we have L-type calcium channels open, and during this phase, calcium is entering the cell, but at the exact same time, potassium is leaving the cell. Because these voltage-gated potassium channels, the normal ones, they're opening. Let me put this into perspective. If only L-type calcium channels were open, this curve would simply go right back up. We'd have another depolarization step. Does that make sense? And if only voltage-gated potassium channels were open, we would repolarize. We'd come straight down. Well, that's not what happens here. Instead, calcium's entering at the same time that potassium leaves, and that starts to balance our charges. Positive charges are entering, and positive charges are leaving, and that creates a flatter line. It's not perfectly flat, but it's here. So at this time, calcium is entering the cell and potassium is leaving the cell. And it's called a plateau phase. It's called the plateau phase. It really elongates the action potential of the contractile myocardial cell. So what creates the plateau phase, everybody? Calcium's entering through L-type calcium channels at the same time that potassium leaves the cell through voltage-gated potassium channels. We only need one more, number 5, so I'm going to put that in here. Number 5 is alive. What color should I use? I'll use a gray. Now, it's closed, Heather. So right here at 4, this one's transient, right? It's transient. So this voltage-gated potassium channel, the fast one, it opens and then closes. So right at the beginning of 4, I just didn't have room to write it in here. But yeah, that's definitely an important point. It's transient. So it opens here and closes there. Boom, open, close. That's why we get this rapid repolarization step, but it's only for a short period of time. It's transient. So at the end of the plateau phase, what do you guys think is going to happen? Well, those L-type calcium channels are going to close. At this point, only the voltage-gated potassium channels are open, and they're going to be fully open. Does that make sense to everybody? If we close the L-type calcium channels, the only thing left is the normal voltage-gated potassium channels, and potassium, whee, just books on out of that cell, repolarizing in a straight line down, in essence, all the way back to resting membrane potential. So here at 5, and I'll just kind of create a box here for it. Here at 5, the L-type calcium channels close. And those normal voltage-gated potassium channels fully open. I mean, they are open. They are wide open at this point. But calcium's no longer leaking in. Only potassium's rushing out. We repolarize to resting membrane potential. If you look at my YouTube videos for this, I draw it out in a lot more detail. I actually draw in the transporters and stuff. I make sure to write every single step, whether channels are opening, whether channels are closing, what ions are moving across the membrane at specific times. I write in every single step. So if you guys want to, and I highly recommend that you do, if you guys want to think about every single step, hint, hint, you should test, then go back, rewatch this video, because everything I said, well, I didn't have room to write it all down. And two, you got the YouTube video to go back through as well. Not to mention, you have lecture to go back through as well. So don't worry, we're going to cover this one more time, and we're not done with this picture up above, because that calcium is darn important. Darn important. Just giving you guys a second. So at rest, these contractile myocardial cells have no positive charges at all. And they're just chilling down here at resting membrane potential. But then an action potential from the autorhythmic cell moving through the conduction pathway is going to hit that myocardium. About plus 30. Good question. But then, as I just said, that action potential from the autorhythmic cell travels through the conduction pathway. It will hit the membrane of this myocardial tissue, at which point we get this rapid depolarization. And here at the tissue, another voltage-gated sodium channel is going to open, allowing for even more current to enter. But it's only open for a brief period of time because it's so darn fast. At the peak, the inactivation gate closes, and a really fast potassium channel, this transient voltage-gated potassium channel, it's going to open just for a short period of time, but it's enough to help bring this back down ever so slightly as it repolarizes, as potassium floods out of that cell. But it's transient, so this fast voltage-gated potassium channel opens, then closes. At about the time that it closes, a voltage-gated calcium channel opens. It's a very unique voltage-gated calcium channel and very important voltage-gated calcium channel called an L-type calcium channel. You must know it, you must know it, you must know it. And calcium starts to enter the cell. You must know that, you must know that, you must know that. In fact, you can take the diagram here and you can just say, you know, kind of what I draw out here. I like to just say at the plateau phase, I treat this like it's ICF and this like it's ECF. And I say calcium influx. I draw this into a lot of my diagrams because it helps me remember. Calcium's entering the cell right here. Calcium's entering the cell right here. During the plateau phase, what ion is entering the cell, everybody? Loverly. Loverly. What ion is also leaving the cell right now? Through this entire plateau phase, we're going to have potassium efflux. It's happening. Potassium is leaving this cell. And the more and more open those voltage-gated potassium channels become, the less flat the plateau phase becomes. And at a certain point, about 400 milliseconds or so, the L-type calcium channels are going to close. And the only thing left over are those voltage-gated potassium channels. And potassium is just going to go rushing out of the cell. Just massive potassium efflux. I mean, it is a torrent. It's a torrent. And you guys are going to see this in an EKG. You're going to be able to easily see this flood of current as potassium rushes out of the cell, trying to rapidly repolarize those myocardial tissues. How do you guys feel about that action potential? Okay, might be able to go home and studying it on your own, a lot's happening. Yep, human body. It'll make sense. If you just go back and write it down step by step, it'll make sense. And it's all really important. And I keep this diagram up here and keep referring to it on purpose. What do we know about muscle? Just depends on how much you remember from last semester. But if you'll recall anything about muscle, is that muscle has contractile properties. And the muscle had a whole bunch of myofilaments, these really cool muscle fibers that helped with the process, like actin, myosin, tropomyosin, troponin, titin, nebulin, and there's other ones as well. Was there a little jog of the memory for most people in that? It's important. Now, you were already examined? You are already tested? There, that's probably a better word. You're already tested on all those myofilaments. I'm not going to test you on them again. That's AMP1 testing stuff. Do you need to know they exist? Hell yeah, you do. But there was something really cool about all those myofilaments when you were learning about them in skeletal muscles. And that was, what is going to initiate the process of muscle contraction? An action potential, right? Isn't that what we have here as an action potential? So it's the exact same thing as skeletal muscle. And then what ion was critical for muscle contraction? What ion is required for the actin-myosin interaction to occur in the first place? Oh, calcium. 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 Calcium is required for muscle contraction. Calcium is required for muscle contraction. Right, you guys kind of remember I did this crazy little diagram right here. But for the neuromuscular junction, we had this sarcoplasmic reticulum. And then as electricity dope down in here, it's going to activate some gates. And that's going to end up opening a gate on the SR. And what happened when these gates, called ryanodine receptors, whether you learned about that or not, I'll be reteaching that. What happened as these gates open is calcium got to flood out of that sarcoplasmic reticulum. True story? You guys kind of remember that? End plate potentials, extra action potentials, calcium, and then calcium binds to troponin. Troponin. Dun, 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 dun. Who doesn't love Carlton? Come on, man. He's the best. Troponin. So calcium binds to troponin, and then troponin causes a conformational change in tropomyosin, and then tropomyosin shifts off of the myosin binding site found on actin, blah, 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 blah. You guys are not going to be tested on all that again, but you do need to know about troponin. So what myofilament does calcium have to bind to cause contraction of muscles? You guys must know that, you must know that, you must know that. Of all of the myofilaments you must know for AMP2, let's go ahead and focus on troponin, because if you can do that, in my mind, you'll be able to, review and remember skeletal muscle contraction with tropomyosin and actin and myosin, and that's all things you can do in your future. So troponin, pretty darn important one, especially for the heart. Has anybody ever worked in a cardio field? Or ever seen anybody that after a heart attack, they did a blood test and they actually test for troponin levels in the blood to see how severe the heart attack was? Anybody ever heard that? No? Yeah, that's what they do. That's what they do, because as tissue in the heart dies, troponin is a pretty easy protein to just depolymerize. and it goes floating off into your bloodstream as tissue dies. So the more heart tissue that's died, the more troponin is out there in your bloodstream, and it's a really easy correlation for doctors to use for the severity of a heart attack. So many cool things out there. All right, next. I know, pieces of the puzzle. Yeah, we'll come back there. Well, there's never going to be tetanus. There's never going to be summation. It's going to be because of the balance of calcium and potassium. You're not wrong, Ashley. It's because of the plateau phase. Actually, let's go ahead and talk about that. That's a great thing to make sure we think about. So everybody, let's stop and listen. While one action potential is occurring, can another action potential occur at the exact same time? Yes or no? Can I get more answers, please? Whether you think it's the simplest question in the world and you're like, Dr. H, you suck. I just want to make sure everybody's on board, no matter how simple it's to you, because this is an important part of the answer. While one action potential is occurring, another one cannot occur in the same location. That's impossible. What word, physiological word, do we use to reference this? What's it called? What's this period of time called where while one action potential is occurring, another one cannot occur? Good, that's refraction. Great job. No worries, Veronica. Thank you so much for trying. It's not the pacemaker, because pacemaker potentials are funky. We could really mess with these. But it's a refractory period. It's a refractory period. Were these couple different types of refractory periods. But I just need you guys to know refractory period, period. End of story. There we go. And if we take this refractory period and we make the refractory period longer, simple question, what would happen to the amount of time required for another action potential to occur? Increase, decrease, no change. So do you guys see that that's exactly what the plateau phase does? It's elongating the action potential relative to all the rest of the action potentials that you've learned that peak and come back down. They peak and come back down. Well, in the heart, they peak and don't just immediately come back down. They have this big, long refractory period. The big, long refractory period is anywhere between 400 milliseconds all the way up to 1200, 1500 milliseconds sometimes. Because what do we know? As long as one action potential is occurring, another one cannot occur. And what's happening during an action potential for a contractile myocardium? So that goes back to this question I was just asking, which is what ion is required for muscle contraction? What ion is required for muscle contraction? Sorry about that. So doesn't it stand to reason that as calcium's entering the cell, there might be some interactions with this calcium and troponin, and we just might have muscle contraction going on. So during the plateau phase, this is where muscle contraction's occurring. The longer the plateau phase, the longer the muscle contraction. Not necessarily stronger, we'll get back to that in the future, but the longer. Yes, no, maybe so? That's a pretty cool part of, and a much more complex. We're not going to go into it in too much detail, but as you change somebody's heart rate, you don't want to mess with the refractory period too much. You really just want to deal with the autorhythmic cells. You'd love every action potential to look exactly the same, but the whole idea of the plateau phase is to elongate out that refractory period so that another contraction cannot occur at the same time. Another contraction cannot occur at the same time. You do not want two contractions overlapping, because muscles summate, and if we end up causing this muscle to contract and then contract again at the same time, then we would end up with tetanus of the heart, which is something you guys learn about in A&P1, right? Is that in skeletal muscle summate. This muscle right here, the more action potentials I send to it, the more power I can produce from it. Well, we do not want summation in the heart, because that would allow the heart to enter tetanus. We never want tetanus of the heart. That's no bueno. We never want a maximum contraction of the heart. Does that make sense? So there's two functions of the plateau phase, I think, is what I was talking about in the narrated PowerPoint. It's been a while since I put together that narrated PowerPoint, but there are two major functions of the plateau phase. If you read your textbook, the number one function of the plateau phase is to prevent tetanus. We never, ever want tetanus of the heart. You'd be dead. We cannot have summation of muscles, cannot have summation of force. One contraction, one relaxation. Two, because calcium's entering the cell, this is going to initiate contraction. It's not the only calcium required, but the plateau phase here, all this calcium coming through the L-type calcium channels is going to help with contraction. So there are two functions of the plateau phase. One, prevent tetanus. Two, contraction. So good. Thank you for asking that question. I think that was Ashley. Can't remember who that was. Gosh, I'm bad with that. Yeah, that was Ashley. I did get it right. Yes. Cool. Kind of out of time, but I want to finish an idea. It won't take up too much extra time. Now, myocardium are unique relative to skeletal muscle. How so? Their anatomy is different, quite different. Therefore, structure determines function. We're going to have variations in function between skeletal muscle and skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle, we want to contract only when we want it to contract. True story? Most. Whether or not it's voluntary or involuntary, skeletal muscle tends to be voluntary. Therefore, we can tell skeletal muscles when to contract and relax. Is everybody with me on that? Skeletal muscles are voluntary, except if it's a reflex. And therefore, we can say, hey, contract. No, contract. We get the choice. Do you get the choice with your heart? All right, heart, beat. Beat harder. No, we don't get a choice with the heart. It just continuously beats over time. Typically 1 beat per second. So what do you think about the energy cost required to run your heart versus skeletal muscles? Which is going to require more energy? Which is going to require more energy? Oh yeah, that cardio tissue requires a ton more energy. And what organelle in our tissues makes the energy of our body? Yeah, it's mitochondria. You better believe it's mitochondria. So what I want you guys to try to see, I don't know, I'm just going to show this picture here, this model here. Where's my open in a new tab? Maybe it'll blow up bigger. Oh, you sons of biscuit eaters, making me do this. We'll just do this. You guys, oh, internet, stop being silly. Give me my bar. You're killing me, Smalls. All right. Well, that's not blowing up at all. But do you guys see all these little purple dots right here? Purple dots, purple dots, purple dots, purple dots, purple dots. Yes, no? So those are mitochondria. And if you look at any picture of the skeletal muscle versus a cardio tissue, what you're going to notice is that skeletal muscle has far fewer mitochondria relative to cardio tissue. Cardio tissue has so many mitochondria running this body. I'm trying to, let me see, model mitochondria. There we go, mitochondria. I'm sorry, I'm trying to get this done for y'all. There's some pictures, there's some diagrams of it. Well, I guess you're just gonna have to trust me because I didn't prepare and I thought I'd be able to find a picture much faster. You guys probably don't understand immunofluorescence very well, but yeah, this is showing different mitochondrial structures. So mitochondrial staining with the MitoTracker green. So as the mitochondria is activated, it becomes more and more, immunofluorescent. And this is just a massive amount of mitochondria. This is a massive amount of mitochondria. Why is this important, Dr. H? I got a point, I promise. This isn't just random. If I have a bag, I'm drawing right now, let me get back to here. If I have a bag like this, right, and I don't have a lot of mitochondria, and I want to put things inside of this bag, can I get a lot or a little relative to a bag that's got just an absolute veritable shit ton of mitochondria? Which of these can I put more stuff in? Which of these two bags, these are mitochondria that I'm squiggling in here, can I get more in A or can I get more in B? This should be an obvious answer. Just help me help you. So the more mitochondria we have, the less bag space we have. Does that make sense? So what just happened to the bag space of our cardio tissue? Increase, decrease, no change. Yeah, we got less bag space. Now, what bag space are we talking about here? We're talking about sarcoplasmic reticulum. Because remember, these contractile tissues have this SR, right? So if I have an SR here, basically I can fill up almost the entire inside of a skeletal muscle with sarcoplasmic reticulum. But down here, I have to have smaller bags of SR. You guys kind of with me on this picture? SR, 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 so forth, so on. I'm going fast here. Why is this important? Well, I teach the SR unique in AMP1. I literally ask my students to write on an exam. If I say, what is the function of the SR? Here's what I want you guys to write down in your notes, and it'll help forever and for always. The SR is a big-ass bag of calcium. Literally, on a test question, if I were to ask you to write something about the SR, I want you to write it's a big-ass bag of calcium. Literally, quote for quote. And you won't ever forget it if you remember it in that regards. The SR is a big-ass bag of calcium. How can it become a big-ass bag of calcium? The outer membrane of the SR is covered in calcium pumps. And these calcium pumps are constantly pumping calcium into the SR. Every microsecond of every day, they're using ATP to pump calcium into the SR, which makes the SR an extremely just deluge of calcium. It's a massive amount of calcium found inside of the SR. Is everybody on board with this idea? This is a big-ass bag of calcium. Yes, no, maybe so? The bigger the SR, the more calcium can be stored. Well, what's going on with the myocardial tissue? Do they have more calcium stored or less calcium stored? Oh, they have less calcium stored. They have less calcium stored. So if I want to run my contractile tissue properly, I still need the appropriate amount of calcium. I can't just rely on my SR storage. Therefore, I need calcium from a different location. And check it out. You guys, L-type calcium channels. What's entering the cell right here as the L-type calcium channels are opening? Calcium. So it's the presence of this calcium right here that's going to be adding to the total amount of calcium so that we can run our hearts constantly. Because the SR is still a big-ass bag of calcium, but there's less calcium inside the SR than there would be for skeletal muscles. So we need to get a source of calcium from somewhere else. And it's coming through those L-type calcium channels. This calcium here, entering through the L-type calcium channels, is going to have an impact on the SR. So on the SR here, there's another channel that is activated by calcium. Okay, this red channel here that I'm drawing in is called the ryanodine receptor. And we're going to abbreviate this capital R, lowercase y, capital R. Capital R, lowercase y, capital R. This is a ryanodine. Ryanodine. So it's a ryanodine receptor. And what's so special about the RYR is it is a calcium sensitive, which means it's opened by calcium channel. It's a very cool channel. It's calcium sensitive calcium channel. So it's opened by calcium, but it also allows calcium to pass through it. How cool is that? I think it's super cool. The ryanodine receptor is a calcium sensitive calcium channel. So now as calcium enters from the ECF, check it out. It's interacting with the RYR. So as calcium enters, it opens the RYR, and what can now start to flood out of the SR as the RYR opens? Because this is a big ass bag of calcium. There's tons of calcium here. So as calcium enters the cell, it activates a calcium sensitive calcium channel, ryanodine receptors. Those open, and the SR now allows for a flood of calcium out. Combining with the calcium from the ECF, those bind to troponin and allow for contraction. We will cover this more tomorrow at the beginning of lecture. We'll go back through and draw this diagram out nice and big. So take a deep breath if you didn't understand all of that. I just wanted to make sure it was in your brain so you could be redundant tomorrow. All right. Peace. Humankind be both, as I always say in my YouTube videos. Humankind be both. Stop being just human. Be humankind. You guys have a great day. I got to get my son to the doctor by 11:15. He's got an ear infection. Text me if you have any questions.